She bought lunch for a lonely veteran. His son was a powerful billionaire. What could inspire such a simple act of kindness? And how might one unexpected encounter change the lives of people who never imagined their paths would cross? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We're so glad you're here for another unforgettable story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest heartfelt stories. Your support means the world to us, and we sincerely appreciate you for watching, sharing, and being part of this amazing community. Now, tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that led to something completely unexpected? With that thought in mind, settle in, relax, and let's begin today's remarkable story. The smallest kindness is often the beginning of the biggest miracle, but no one ever recognizes it until it's too late. Emily Carter had heard those words from her grandmother years ago, though she had never imagined they would echo through her mind on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The lunch rush at Harper's Diner had finally begun to slow, leaving behind the comforting scent of fresh coffee, grilled burgers, and homemade chicken soup lingering in the warm air. Outside, a chilly October breeze carried yellow leaves across the sidewalk as people hurried past the windows, most too busy to notice anyone sitting alone. Emily wiped down the counter with practiced movements, her feet aching after working since 6 that morning. She had another evening shift waiting across town, and the overdue rent notice folded inside her apron pocket felt heavier than it should. Still, whenever a customer smiled, she smiled back. That was simply who she was. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as an elderly man stepped inside. His faded olive green field jacket looked decades old, carefully repaired in several places, and a weathered baseball cap shaded tired blue eyes that carried the quiet weight of countless memories. He walked with measured dignity rather than weakness, pausing only briefly before taking a seat at the last booth near the window. Some customers glanced at him, before returning to their conversations, but no one greeted him. Emily picked up a menu and approached with her usual warmth. "Good afternoon, sir. Take your time." The old man thanked her with a gentle smile that seemed almost surprised to be welcomed. When she returned a few minutes later, he ordered the daily special and a cup of black coffee. His voice was calm, polite, and unmistakably grateful for even the smallest courtesy. Emily entered the order, delivered the meal, and watched discreetly from the counter as he carefully unfolded a worn leather wallet. Inside were only a few crumpled dollar bills and loose coins. He counted them once, then again, his expression never changing, though his shoulders seemed just a little heavier after the second count. Quietly, he closed the wallet without touching the food. Emily walked over. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. The man offered an apologetic smile. "I seem to be $3 short today. That's my mistake. Would you mind taking the coffee back? That should make up the difference." There was no embarrassment in his voice, only quiet acceptance, as though disappointments had become familiar companions. Emily looked at the untouched plate, then at the old man's eyes. Without saying another word, she reached into her apron, pulled out a few folded bills from her own tip money, and handed them to the cashier. "Lunch is covered," she said with a smile. "Please enjoy it while it's still hot." The veteran looked at her for several long seconds, as though searching for a reason behind her generosity. Finally, he nodded once. "Thank you, miss." He paused before adding softly, "One day, kindness always finds its way home." Emily laughed lightly, thinking it was simply something kind people said. She had no way of knowing that before the week was over, those quiet words would change everything she believed about strangers, gratitude, and the extraordinary lives hidden behind the most ordinary faces. The next morning, Emily arrived at Harper's Diner before sunrise, just as she always did. The streets were still quiet, and the first golden light of dawn reflected across the storefront windows. She tied on her apron, started the coffee machines, and greeted the familiar regulars who drifted in one by one. For a while, the memory of the elderly veteran faded beneath the rhythm of refilling mugs, carrying plates, and exchanging cheerful greetings. Yet sometime after noon, the bell above the front door chimed again, and she looked up instinctively. There he was, the same weathered jacket, the same neatly combed silver hair beneath the faded cap, and the same calm expression that seemed untouched by the rush of the world outside. This time he smiled the moment their eyes met. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter," he said politely. Emily blinked in surprise. You remembered my name? The old man chuckled softly. When someone shows kindness without expecting anything back, it deserves to be remembered. Emily smiled as she guided him to the same booth by the window. The usual? She asked. If it is not too much trouble. Not at all. She brought him the daily special along with a fresh cup of black coffee, before he even had to ask. As she set the plate down, she noticed something she had missed the day before. Carefully pinned inside the edge of his jacket was a small service ribbon, almost hidden beneath the worn fabric. It was faded with age, but meticulously clean. There was also a tiny American flag pin polished so carefully that it caught the afternoon sunlight. He ate slowly, never wasting a bite, pausing now and then to watch people passing outside the window. A young mother hurried across the street with 2 children. He smiled. A delivery driver waved at someone across the block. He smiled again. It was as if the simple sight of ordinary life brought him quiet happiness. Between customers, Emily found herself stopping by his table for brief conversations. She learned his name was Walter Hayes. He never spoke much about himself, but every answer carried warmth instead of self-pity. When she asked whether he had family nearby, he looked toward the window for a moment before replying, I do. They are busy living their own lives. That is exactly what every parent hopes for. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet acceptance. Were you in the army? Emily asked, gently, nodding toward the ribbon. Walter looked down, almost as if he had forgotten it was there. A very long time ago. Do you ever talk about those days? He smiled faintly and shook his head. The important parts are not the stories people tell. They are the people they remember. Before she could ask another question, another table needed her attention. Hours slipped by, and when Walter finally finished his meal, he carefully counted out enough cash to pay every cent this time. Then he folded a single dollar bill and left it beneath his empty coffee cup as a tip. Emily almost laughed. The tip was tiny, but somehow it felt more valuable than much larger ones she received from wealthier customers. As Walter stood to leave, he paused beside the front door and looked back. Miss Carter, he called. Never believe that kindness disappears. Most of the time, it is simply traveling farther than we can see. Emily watched him step onto the sidewalk and slowly disappear into the afternoon crowd. She did not realize someone across the street, sitting quietly inside a dark sedan with tinted windows, had been watching that entire exchange without taking their eyes off either of them. For the rest of that week, Walter Hayes became a quiet part of Emily Carter's routine. He never came at exactly the same hour, yet somehow he always appeared during the brief moments when the diner slowed just enough for conversation. He always ordered something simple, always paid carefully, and always thanked every employee before leaving. The other servers barely noticed him, but Emily did. She began setting aside the booth by the window whenever it happened to be available, not because he expected special treatment, but because she knew he liked watching the world outside. One rainy afternoon, as gray clouds settled over the town and steady drops traced soft lines across the glass, Walter arrived carrying a small paper bag that looked almost empty. His jacket was damp from the walk, yet he greeted everyone with the same gentle smile. Emily quickly brought him a towel to dry his hands and placed a steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of him. This one is on the house, she said. With a grin, Walter shook his head immediately. No, Miss Carter. Your kindness has already been generous enough. Emily simply smiled back. Then consider it my favorite customer discount. Walter laughed quietly, a warm, genuine laugh that seemed to erase years from his face. As they talked, a young boy stepped into the diner, dripping wet from the rain. He looked no older than 10 and clutched a backpack almost as large as himself. The child hesitated near the entrance, staring at the menu board before slowly reaching into his pocket. After counting a few coins, his shoulders dropped in disappointment. Before Emily could say anything, Walter quietly stood, walked over, and handed the boy the paper bag he had been carrying. I packed a sandwich this morning, he said kindly, but I believe someone else needs it more today. The boy looked at him with wide eyes. Are you sure? Walter nodded. Absolutely. The child thanked him over and over before hurrying back into the rain with the bag held tightly against his chest. Emily watched the entire moment in silence. You gave away your own lunch, she said softly after Walter returned to his booth. Walter shrugged as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. I have eaten enough meals in my lifetime to know that hunger always feels longer when you are young. Emily felt something tighten gently inside her heart. She had assumed she was the one helping Walter, yet every time she saw him, he quietly found someone else to encourage. Before leaving that afternoon, Walter carefully folded his napkin and slipped a small object into his pocket. For the briefest moment, Emily caught sight of polished bronze reflecting beneath the diner lights. It looked like an old military medal, worn smooth by time but treated with remarkable care. She wondered why a man who seemed to own so little guarded that single keepsake with such devotion. Walter noticed her glance and smiled without explanation. Some things remind us who we were, he said. Others remind us who we should never stop becoming. Then he adjusted his weathered jacket, tipped his cap politely, and stepped outside into the steady rain. Emily remained by the window long after he disappeared around the corner, unaware that the dark sedan parked across the street had returned once again. Inside, a sharply dressed man lowered a pair of reading glasses, watched Walter walk away through the rain, then quietly turned his attention toward Emily with an expression that was no longer curiosity, but Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and crisp autumn air, but Walter Hayes did not walk through the diner's front door. Emily noticed almost immediately, though she told herself not to overthink it. People had appointments, errands, and unexpected plans. There was no reason an elderly man needed to appear every day. She focused on serving customers, refilling coffee, and carrying plates from the kitchen, yet every time the bell above the entrance rang, her eyes lifted almost automatically. Each time, it was someone else. By Sunday afternoon, the familiar booth by the window remained empty again. Emily found herself glancing toward it while wiping tables, remembering Walter's quiet smile and thoughtful conversations. Even the cook noticed. "Your regular friend taking a vacation?" he joked. Emily smiled politely. Maybe, but something about the silence felt different. Monday came and went with no sign of him. Tuesday passed the same way. The little routine that had quietly become part of her week simply vanished without explanation. Emily realized she knew almost nothing about Walter beyond his name. She had never asked where he lived, never requested a phone number, and never imagined there might come a day when she would wish she had. On Wednesday evening, after finishing her shift, she stepped outside and looked down the sidewalk where he usually disappeared after leaving the diner. People hurried home carrying grocery bags and briefcases. A city bus rumbled past, followed by a cyclist ringing a bell. Life moved exactly as it always had, except one familiar face was missing. She sighed and started the short walk toward the bus stop. Across the street, the dark sedan was parked once again. This time, however, it did not remain there long. The engine started quietly, and the vehicle pulled away before she noticed it. The next morning began like any other. Emily arrived before sunrise, unlocked the front door, and switched on the lights. The smell of fresh coffee soon filled the diner. Customers trickled in steadily as the morning wore on. Around 11 o'clock, an unusual stillness settled over the street outside. One customer looked toward the window and frowned. Another stood from his booth for a better view. Emily carried a tray of sandwiches toward table 6 before realizing nearly everyone inside had turned their attention outdoors. She followed their gaze. One after another, sleek black luxury vehicles rolled silently to the curb in front of Harper's Diner. There were far too many to belong to a wedding party or business meeting. Each polished sedan stopped with remarkable precision, forming an orderly line along the street. People on the sidewalk slowed to watch. Nearby shop owners stepped outside their businesses. Curious whispers spread from one storefront to the next. A uniformed driver exited the first car and opened the rear passenger door. Instead of rushing, the man inside remained seated for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts before stepping onto the sidewalk. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility rather than attention. His expression remained calm, yet there was unmistakable purpose in every step as he approached the entrance. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly when he entered. Conversation throughout the restaurant faded almost instantly. His eyes scanned the room only once before settling directly on Emily. He offered a respectful nod, walked toward her with measured steps, and asked in a composed voice that carried easily through the silent diner, "Excuse me, Are you Miss Emily Carter? Emily blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the stranger's composed presence. Yes, she replied cautiously. I am Emily Carter. The man offered a warm, respectful smile rather than extending authority. My name is Daniel Hayes. The name meant nothing to her at first. He continued before she could respond. I have been hoping to meet you in person. Around them, the diner remained unusually quiet. Customers pretended to sip their coffee while listening closely. Even the kitchen staff paused near the service window. Emily searched his face, trying to remember if they had met before, but she was certain they had not. Have we met? She asked. Daniel shook his head. No, but someone very important to me has spoken about you many times. Emily felt a flicker of recognition. Walter. Daniel's smile softened immediately. Yes, Walter Hayes is my father. For a brief moment, the words seemed not to register. Emily simply stared at him. The elderly veteran who counted every dollar before buying lunch, who carried a patched jacket and walked through town with quiet humility, had a son standing before her in an impeccably tailored suit, surrounded by an entire motorcade. Daniel noticed her surprise and spoke gently. I realize this must seem unexpected. Emily managed a small nod. I have been wondering where he has been. He stopped coming. Daniel's expression became thoughtful. He is doing well. He asked me not to worry anyone, but after hearing your name so often, I felt I should come myself. Emily let out a relieved breath she had not realized she had been holding. I am glad he is all right. Daniel studied her reaction carefully. There was no excitement, no curiosity about wealth, no eagerness to ask questions about his success. Her first concern had simply been Walter's well-being. It confirmed everything his father had told him. Would you have a few minutes after your shift? Daniel asked. There are some things I believe my father would like you to know. Emily glanced toward her manager, who quietly nodded from across the room, equally curious but understanding. I finish in about an hour. I will gladly wait. Instead of requesting special treatment, Daniel selected the very booth where Walter always sat by the window. He ordered a simple cup of black coffee and thanked Emily when she placed it before him. She noticed how naturally he rested his hand on the edge of the table, almost exactly where Walter always had. Even the small smile he offered before taking the first sip reminded her of the older man. As the hour passed, several people walking outside recognized Daniel through the window. A few stopped, whispering to one another before pulling out their phones. Emily overheard one customer quietly say, "That is Daniel Hayes. He owns Hayes Global." Another immediately replied, "The billionaire?" Emily looked back toward the booth. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the attention or simply unconcerned by it. He sat patiently reading a small leather notebook while waiting for her shift to end. When the lunch crowd finally thinned, Emily untied her apron and approached his table. Daniel stood politely as she arrived. "Thank you for taking the time," he said. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed an old photograph. It showed a much younger Walter wearing his military uniform, standing proudly beside a smiling teenage boy whose eyes were unmistakably Daniel's. Daniel handed the photograph to Emily with quiet reverence. "My father carried this with him every single day," he said softly. "But there is something even more remarkable that he carried with him after meeting you." Emily accepted the photograph with both hands, studying the younger Walter standing proudly beside his son. The resemblance between the man in the picture and the gentleman she had come to know was unmistakable, though the years had softened the sharpness of his face into quiet wisdom. Daniel waited until she looked up before speaking again. "My father was never poor," he said calmly. "He chose a simple life after retiring because he wanted to spend his days meeting people without anyone recognizing his last name." Emily frowned slightly, unsure she had heard him correctly. Daniel continued, his voice steady and sincere. "For more than 10 years, he traveled to small towns, rode public buses, ate at neighborhood diners, and wore the same old jacket you always saw. He believed that when titles disappear, people reveal who they truly are." Emily slowly sat across from him, still holding the photograph. "So everything was intentional?" Daniel shook his head. "Not everything. The worn jacket is real. The medals are real. The years he served. Our country are real. The loneliness you saw was real as well. My father lost many lifelong friends over the years, and although our family visits often, he insisted on keeping his independence. What was intentional was allowing people to see only an ordinary old veteran instead of the father of a businessman. Emily remained silent, remembering every conversation they had shared. Walter had never complained, never hinted at wealth, and never treated anyone differently. Daniel smiled faintly. When he called me after meeting you, he did not mention the lunch you bought him until the very end. Instead, he talked about the waitress who remembered his favorite table, who listened without rushing him, who smiled before knowing whether he could afford to leave a tip, and who treated him with the same respect she showed everyone else. Emily felt her cheeks warm. I only did what anyone should do. Daniel looked at her kindly. You would be surprised how rarely that happens. He reached into his jacket once more and removed a small notebook with a weathered leather cover. This belonged to my father. Every evening, he wrote down one thing that restored his faith in people. Emily glanced at the pages as Daniel carefully opened it. Some entries were only a sentence long. A stranger returning a lost wallet. A teenager helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries. A child sharing an umbrella. Daniel turned several pages before stopping near the end. He handed the notebook to Emily. Written in Walter's careful handwriting were the words, "Today, I met a young woman named Emily Carter. She noticed an old man before she noticed his appearance. She paid for $3 without making me feel small. She reminded me that kindness still exists where no cameras are watching." Emily blinked back unexpected tears. Daniel allowed the silence to linger before quietly adding, "That entry was the happiest I had heard him sound in months." Emily closed the notebook gently. "I wish I could thank him for saying those things." Daniel smiled. "You can. He asked me to invite you somewhere tomorrow afternoon." Emily looked up with quiet surprise. "He wants to see me?" "Very much." Daniel nodded. "There is someone else he would like you to meet, and there is a story he believes you deserve to hear from him personally." Emily carefully returned the notebook and photograph, still trying to process everything she had learned. As they stood to leave the diner together, she glanced once more toward Walter's familiar booth by the window. For the first time, she realized that the greatest secret the elderly veteran had carried was never his family's wealth. It was his unwavering belief that genuine character could only be discovered when no one thought another person had anything to offer in return. The following afternoon, Daniel arrived exactly on time in the same understated sedan he had driven the day before. There was no long procession of luxury vehicles this time. Only the quiet confidence of someone who understood that some moments did not require a grand entrance. Emily had changed into a simple navy blue sweater and jeans after finishing her morning shift. As they drove through the outskirts of town, she expected they might arrive at a sprawling mansion or an impressive corporate headquarters. Instead, Daniel turned onto a peaceful country road lined with towering oak trees whose autumn leaves shimmered in shades of gold and crimson. At the end of the road stood a modest white farmhouse surrounded by a wide front porch, a vegetable garden, and a weathered American flag gently waving in the afternoon breeze. Walter Hayes was sitting on a wooden rocking chair with a thick blanket over his knees and a mug of coffee resting beside him. The moment he saw Emily step out of the car, his face brightened with the same warm smile she had come to know at the diner. "Miss Carter," he called cheerfully. "I was beginning to think you might decide I had told my son too many stories." Emily laughed softly as she walked toward him. "I have never been happier to find out someone was keeping a secret." Walter stood slowly, extending both hands toward her. "Thank you for coming." The sincerity in his voice made the simple greeting feel deeply personal. Daniel quietly excused himself, leaving the two of them on the porch while he disappeared into the house to prepare fresh coffee. Emily looked around, surprised by the simplicity of everything she saw. The porch furniture had clearly been repaired more than once. The flower beds were neat but ordinary. A faded wind chime swayed gently near the steps. Nothing suggested unimaginable wealth. Walter noticed her expression and smiled knowingly. "People often assume comfort comes from expensive things," he said. "I have discovered it usually comes from familiar ones." Emily nodded. "This place feels peaceful. It has been home for more than 40 years. Walter settled back into his chair and gestured for Emily to sit beside him. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. They simply watched birds gather near a small feeder hanging from an old maple tree. Finally, Walter reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the bronze medal Emily had briefly seen at the diner. He placed it gently in her hands. "This was awarded to me many years ago," he said. People think it represents courage. They are mistaken. It reminds me how many ordinary people carried one another through difficult days simply by refusing to stop caring. Emily carefully examined the medal before trying to hand it back. Walter closed her fingers around it instead. Keep it for a little while. She looked at him in surprise. I cannot accept something this important. Walter smiled gently. I am not giving it away. I simply want you to understand what it feels like to hold a reminder that kindness always outlives achievement. Just then Daniel returned carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of homemade apple pie. As they shared dessert together on the quiet porch, conversation flowed naturally between stories of childhood, favorite books, neighborhood memories, and the changing seasons. There was no discussion of business deals, stock markets, or wealth. By the time the afternoon sun began dipping behind the trees, Emily realized she had completely forgotten Daniel was one of the most successful businessmen in the country. To her, he was simply a devoted son. Walter watched the easy conversation between them with quiet satisfaction before setting down his coffee cup and saying softly, "There is one final reason I asked you here today, and it is something neither my son nor I can accomplish without your help." Emily looked at Walter with quiet curiosity. How could I possibly help? Walter folded his hands together and glanced toward Daniel before answering. For years, my son and I have supported organizations that serve veterans across the country. We have donated buildings, equipment, scholarships, and medical programs. Those things matter, but I have learned something important. Money can build a place. It cannot create warmth inside it. Emily listened carefully as Walter continued. The people who visit those centers are not looking only for assistance. Many of them are searching for someone who will simply sit beside them, remember their names, and ask how they are doing. That is something no check can ever purchase. Daniel nodded in agreement. My father has reminded me of that lesson more times than I can count. Walter smiled at his son before turning back to Emily. Would you consider helping us design a community program that focuses on human connection instead of charity alone? Emily looked genuinely surprised. I do not have experience running organizations. No, Walter replied softly. But you have experience seeing people. The words settled over the porch with gentle honesty. Emily thought back to the small diner where every customer carried an invisible story. Some celebrated birthdays. Others quietly mourned losses. Some arrived with friends, while others came simply because they did not want to eat alone. She had never considered those ordinary moments a special skill. I only try to treat everyone the way I hope someone would treat my own family, she said. Walter's smile grew wider. Exactly. Daniel reached into a folder he had brought from the house and laid several sketches across the porch table. They showed plans for a renovated community center that would include a reading room, a family kitchen, a quiet garden, and a gathering space for veterans and local residents. Everything is nearly ready, Daniel explained. The only thing still missing is the heart of the project. Father insisted we wait until we found the right person to help shape that part. Emily carefully studied the drawings. These are beautiful. Daniel pointed toward an empty section labeled Community Welcome Program. Father left this entire section unfinished because he believed the ideas should come from someone whose kindness had never been influenced by recognition. Emily laughed softly in disbelief. You are giving me far too much credit. Walter gently shook his head. No, Miss Carter. We are giving you trust. The afternoon drifted into evening as the 3 of them talked through simple ideas, greeting every visitor by name. Weekly shared meals where everyone sat together regardless of background. Volunteer reading hours for grandchildren visiting their grandparents. Holiday gatherings for veterans with no nearby family. None of the ideas were expensive, yet each one reflected the same quiet compassion Emily had shown inside the diner. As the sun settled below the trees, Walter stood slowly and walked toward the small flagpole near the edge of the porch. He carefully lowered the American flag for the evening with practiced respect before folding it neatly. Returning to Emily, he handed her the folded bronze medal once again. This time, when she tried to return it, he smiled and closed her hand around it. Now I am giving it to you, he said. Not because of what you did for me, but because you reminded an old soldier that goodness still walks this country every single day. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked from Walter to Daniel. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They did not need to. Sometimes the deepest gratitude required no speech at all, only the quiet understanding that one ordinary act of kindness had grown into something none of them could have imagined. Over the following year, the quiet dream that began on Walter Hayes's front porch slowly became a reality. The community center opened its doors without grand advertisements or extravagant celebrations. Instead, neighbors arrived carrying homemade pies, children brought handwritten welcome cards, veterans shared old family photographs, and volunteers greeted every visitor by name. Emily Carter accepted the role of community director only after Walter convinced her that leadership was simply another form of service. Every Wednesday afternoon, she organized shared lunches where no one sat alone unless they chose to. Every Friday evening, local high school students visited to listen to stories from veterans whose experiences might otherwise have been forgotten. Daniel Hayes continued providing resources whenever they were needed, but he intentionally stayed in the background, allowing the center to grow around the people rather than around his family's name. Whenever reporters asked why the project felt so different from other charitable programs, Daniel always answered with the same simple sentence: because it began with kindness instead of publicity. Walter visited whenever his health allowed, always choosing the same rocking chair on the front porch overlooking the garden. He smiled every time he saw strangers becoming friends over coffee or children laughing beside veterans who had become honorary grandparents. This, he often whispered to Emily, is what I hoped people would build long after I was gone. Several years later, on a peaceful autumn morning that looked remarkably like the day they first met, the center held a quiet gathering in Walter's memory. There were no grand speeches. Instead, dozens of people shared small moments they had experienced because one gentle veteran had believed that every person deserved dignity before judgment. Emily stood near the entrance, the bronze medal resting safely inside a small display case beside Walter's favorite photograph with Daniel. Visitors paused to read the handwritten journal entry describing the waitress who had quietly paid $3 for a stranger without expecting anything in return. Many smiled. Some wiped away tears. Daniel joined Emily near the display and looked around the bustling building filled with conversation, laughter, and warmth. My father used to tell me that success is measured by the lives we brighten, not the numbers we collect, he said quietly. Emily nodded. He was right. Just then, the front door opened, and a young girl stepped cautiously inside with her grandmother. The little girl looked toward the small cafe in the corner before whispering that she had forgotten her lunch money. Without hesitation, Emily smiled, walked behind the counter, and prepared a warm bowl of soup with fresh bread. She carried the tray over and gently placed it in front of the child. "This one is already taken care of," she said with the same kindness she had once offered another stranger. The little girl looked up with grateful eyes and asked, "Why would someone do that for me?" Emily glanced briefly toward Walter's photograph, where his familiar smile seemed almost alive beneath the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Then she looked back at the child and answered softly, "Because kindness always finds its way home." Outside, golden leaves drifted gently across the walkway as families arrived together. Veterans exchanged greetings on the porch, and neighbors held the door open for one another without giving it a second thought. No one there measured wealth by bank accounts anymore. They measured it by compassion freely shared, quiet respect generously given, and the simple courage to notice someone who might otherwise have remained invisible. And in that ordinary act of seeing another human being with kindness, Walter Hayes's greatest legacy continued to grow, one heart at a time.